On November 14th, 1924, a man was locked inside a solitary holding cell in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He had no tools, he had no water, and when he was locked in, he was completely dry. 7 hours later, the morning shift opened the steel door. The man was gone, but the cell wasn't empty. When the heavy door swung open, 40 gallons of freezing cold seawater poured out into the hallway. The police report was buried. The arresting officer, a man named Lachlan Moore, refused to speak about it until days before his death in 1952. He claimed the man didn't escape. He claimed the man simply leaked. This is Lachlan Moore's story. I can still smell the salt. Even after all these years, living out here in the middle of the province, away from the coast, I wake up smelling kelp and dead fish. It stays in your nose. It started on a Thursday night. It was a miserable night to be a cop in Halifax. It wasn't snowing, but it wasn't raining either. It was that freezing mist that soaks right through your wool coat and settles in your bones. I was patrolling the shipping yards down by Lower Water Street. It's a rough area. Usually, I'd be chasing off drunks or breaking up fights between sailors who had just come into port. But that night, the streets were dead silent. I was walking past a stack of crates near the pier when I saw him. He was just sitting there on a wooden bollard, which is one of those short posts you tie ships to. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was just in a grey suit that looked like it was made 30 years ago. He had no hat, and he had no shoes. I walked up to him, shining my torch in his face. I expected him to flinch or cover his eyes, but he didn't. He just stared right through the light. I asked him what he was doing out in the freezing cold without a coat. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. I moved closer. And that's when I noticed the first thing that made my stomach turn. It was freezing out, maybe 33 degrees Fahrenheit. I was shivering, but this man was sweating. Thick, heavy drops were rolling down his forehead and neck. It didn't make sense. A man sitting still in the freezing cold shouldn't be sweating like he just ran a marathon. I told him he needed to come with me to the station, if only to get out of the cold. I grabbed his arm to help him stand up. I wish I hadn't touched him. His skin didn't feel like skin. It felt cold and clammy, like touching a raw fish at the market. And when he stood up, I heard a sound. It was a wet, squelching noise, like his clothes were filled with water. But looking at him, his suit looked dry. I asked him his name. He opened his mouth like he was going to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a mouthful of clear water just spilled out over his lips and down his chin. I stepped back, wiping a splash of it off my hand. I brought it to my nose. It didn't smell like vomit or spit. It smelled like the deep ocean. I should have left him there. I should have walked away and let the night take him. But I was a cop, and I had a job to do. I handcuffed him and walked him back to the station. I didn't know it then, but I was walking a nightmare right into our home. The station was worn. We had the big coal stove going in the corner, and the air was usually thick with tobacco smoke and stale coffee. But the second I walked that man through the front door, the temperature seemed to drop. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. He didn't ask who the man was. He just wrinkled his nose and asked me what the hell that smell was. He told me it smelled like something had died under the floorboards. I didn't answer him. I just wanted to get this guy booked and into a cell so I could go wash my hands. I guided the man over to the bench to search him. This is standard procedure. You have to check for knives, razors, anything they could use to hurt themselves. I reached into the left pocket of his soaking wet suit jacket. It felt wrong. It wasn't just wet cloth. It felt slick, like the inside of an oyster. My hand slid right to the bottom of the pocket, and I pulled out a handful of grey sludge. It was sand. Heavy, wet, coarse sand. I checked the other pockets. It was the same thing. His pants pockets, his jacket pockets, even the small inside pocket of his coat. They were all packed tight with wet sand. It didn't make any sense. If he had fallen in the harbour, the sand would have washed out, not packed itself in. I dumped the sludge into the trash bin. The man didn't react. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like he was on a boat in rough water. That's when I noticed the puddle. We had been standing there for maybe 2 minutes, but a dark, spreading pool of water had formed around his bare feet. It was moving fast, running across the wooden floorboards towards the sergeant's desk. The sergeant yelled at me to get him locked up before he flooded the whole damn lobby. I grabbed the man by the shoulder again. His suit was now completely saturated. Water was dripping off his cuffs. It was dripping off his nose. It was like he was a sponge that was being squeezed by an invisible hand. I walked him down the hallway to the holding cells. We have 4 cells. Number 1 and number 2 were full of drunks sleeping it off. Number 3 had a broken lock. So I took him to the end of the hall. Cell number 4. Cell number 4 was our solitary unit. It was basically a concrete box. Concrete floor, concrete walls, and a heavy steel door with a small viewing grate about eye level. It was built to hold violent offenders, people who tried to kick the bars out. It was solid. I pushed him inside. He didn't resist. He just shuffled into the corner and sat down on the floor, facing the wall. He pulled his knees up to his chest. I slammed the heavy steel door shut. I turned the key. I heard the heavy thud click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I stood there for a second, listening. Usually, when you lock a guy up, he starts yelling. He screams that he's innocent, or he begs for a cigarette, or he curses at you. But this guy made no noise. Well, that's not entirely true. I pressed my ear against the steel door. I could hear something. It was a rhythmic, wet sound. Squelch. Drip. Squelch. Drip. It sounded like someone wringing out a wet towel over a bucket. I told myself it was just his wet clothes dripping on the concrete. I told myself to stop imagining things. I walked back to the front desk to write up the arrest report. The sergeant was mopping up the puddle in the lobby. He was complaining that the water was ruining the finish on the floor. He told me the water was weird. He said it was gritty. I sat down at my desk and looked at my hand, the hand I had used to search the prisoner. It was dry now, but it was covered in a fine white powder. I rubbed my thumb and finger together. It felt rough. I licked my finger. It was salt. Pure salt. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was now 1:15 in the morning. I thought the night was almost over. I thought the hard part was done. I was wrong. The night was just getting started. The station settled into that deep, heavy silence you only get at 2 o'clock in the morning. The drunks in the first 2 cells had passed out. The sergeant had gone into the back room to catch a nap. It was just me and the ticking clock. And the smell. The smell hadn't gone away. If anything, it was getting stronger. It wasn't just the smell of the harbour anymore. It was sharper. It smelled like brine and old, wet iron. It was making my eyes water. Around 2:15, Thomas came in from his rounds. Thomas was our night watchman. He was an older guy, tough as nails, the kind of guy who had seen everything in this city, and nothing scared him. But that night, Thomas looked rattled. He didn't even say hello. He just walked up to my desk and asked me if I had called the plumber. I looked at him confused. I told him no. Thomas shook his head. He told me there was a leak in the cell block, a bad one. He said he could hear water running all the way from the back door. He thought a main pipe had burst in the wall. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told Thomas that wasn't possible. There were no water pipes running through the wall of cell number 4. It was just concrete and rebar. Thomas didn't argue. He just told me to come and see for myself. We walked down the hallway. The lights in the corridor were dim, just low-wattage bulbs casting long yellow shadows. As we got closer to the end of the hall, I heard it. It wasn't the dripping sound anymore. It was a steady, gurgling rush. It sounded like a bathtub faucet turned on full blast. And it was coming from behind the steel door of cell number 4. I stopped about 10 feet away from the door. I shone my flashlight at the floor. Water was seeping out from under the steel door. But it wasn't just trickling. It was being forced out. It was bubbling up around the doorframe, hissing as it hit the hallway air. The water was dark, almost black in the dim light, and it was moving fast. It was already creeping up the toes of my boots. Thomas pointed his light at the door hinges. They were usually black iron. Now, right before our eyes, they looked orange. Rust. Bright, flaky rust was spreading across the metal like a disease, eating into the steel. I shouted at the prisoner. I told him to step away from the door. I told him to answer me. There was no answer, just the sound of rushing water. Thomas looked at me. His face was pale. He asked me how one man could make that much water. He asked me if I had put a fire hose in there with him. I didn't have an answer. I knew the cell was only 6 feet by 8 feet. It was a sealed box. If water was coming out of the cracks like that, it meant the water level inside had to be rising. Fast. I grabbed the key ring from my belt. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped them. I knew I had to open that door. If I didn't, the man inside was going to drown. But a part of me, a loud part in the back of my brain, was screaming at me to leave it locked. It told me that whatever was inside that cell wasn't a man. I ignored it. I waded through the water. It was ankle deep now and freezing cold. It numbed my feet instantly. I jammed the key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. The mechanism felt gritty, like it was full of sand. I used both hands. I twisted as hard as I could. I heard a crack like a gunshot. The rust inside the lock gave way. The bolt slid back. I gripped the handle. I braced myself. I nodded at Thomas to get ready. I pulled the heavy steel door open. When that door opened, it didn't feel like opening a cell. It felt like a dam breaking. A wall of freezing water smashed into my chest. It knocked the wind right out of me. It knocked Thomas off his feet. We both went down hard into the hallway water, splashing and gasping for air. The water that hit us wasn't just cold. It was ice cold. It burned my skin like fire. And the taste. I swallowed a mouthful of it as I went down. It was so salty it made me gag. It tasted like the bottom of the deepest trench in the Atlantic. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the wet floor. I grabbed my flashlight, which was rolling in the current, and aimed it into the cell. I expected to see the man standing there. I expected him to rush me. I had my hand on my baton, ready to fight. But the beam of light hit the back wall. The cell was empty. I stepped inside. The water was draining out fast now, swirling around the drain in the center of the floor. I swept the light left, then right. There was nowhere to hide. It was just a concrete box. No windows, no vents, no way out. But he was gone. Thomas was standing in the doorway behind me. He was shining his light on the floor in the corner. He asked me, in a voice that sounded very small, where the prisoner went. I followed his light. There, in the corner where the man had been sitting, was a pile of gray, wet cloth. It was his suit. It wasn't thrown there. It wasn't discarded. It was collapsed. The jacket was buttoned. The pants were still tucked into where the shoes would have been. It looked like a man had been sitting there 1 second and then had simply turned into liquid the next. I walked over to the pile of clothes. I didn't want to touch it. God help me, I really didn't. But I had to know. I poked the shoulder of the jacket with my baton. It squished flat. There was no body inside. No bones, no skin, just wet wool and sludge. I knelt down. I saw something glistening on the collar of the shirt. It wasn't skin. It was a long, dark strip of kelp, wrapped around the inside of the neck, where a throat should have been. I stood up, backing away until my back hit the wall. That's when I saw the mark. My flashlight beam dragged across the concrete wall. About 5 feet up from the floor, running in a perfect circle around the entire room, was a thick white line. It was a salt ring. It looked exactly like the mark the tide leaves on a pier when the water goes down. I looked at Thomas. I looked at the 5-foot mark on the wall. I looked at the empty, collapsed suit on the floor. The math didn't work. For the water to be that high, the room had to be watertight. It wasn't. And for the man to be gone, he had to have walked past us. He didn't. Thomas looked at me and said he was going to be sick. He turned and ran down the hallway. I stood there, alone in the freezing damp. I listened for breathing. I listened for footsteps. But all I heard was the sound of the last few gallons of the Atlantic Ocean gurgling down the drain, taking the prisoner with it. The official police report filed the next morning stated that the prisoner had escaped due to watchman negligence and that a water main had burst in the basement, flooding the cell block. However, no plumber was ever called to fix a burst pipe. No search party was ever sent out to find the barefoot man in the grey suit. The station logbook from that night still exists in the Halifax archives. The ink on the pages dated November 14th is smeared and illegible, washed away by salt water. But there is one piece of evidence that remains. Constable Moore kept the lock from cell number 4. He kept it in a box under his bed until the day he died. When his grandson found it years later, he tried to open it. He couldn't. The entire internal mechanism had been destroyed. It hadn't just rusted, it had been encrusted with barnacles on the inside.